Hey, everybody, it's Thursday. This is technically, I don't know. I guess it's technically episode 5 because you have to have one kind of like fake episode in the hopper to get a show onto iTunes and Spotify and all that stuff. This is the 4th kind of real episode of our brand new show, Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I'm your host, Dan Vespris, and this is an Old Man Squad Sports Network podcast. One of 2 so far. There will be 3 by next week. There might even be 4 or 5 by next week. I'm a guy who hates to do nothing for more than about an hour. Drives me absolutely up the wall crazy. And the fact that so many of you guys have kind of come out of the woodwork, people that I knew from the past have come out, people that I know from the present that want to be involved in this new podcasting network. I'm blown away. So what I will say here at the front end is, for those of you that are listening to the show or watching, I guess you may be watching after the fact, if you'd like to be a part of it, let me know. I don't know what the timeline would be on everything, but my goal is basically to create a podcast utopia. That was the other name that I came up with for the sports network, but it sounded a little bit, I don't know, dystopian, actually. Because every movie you ever watch where they're like, oh yeah, it's going to be a utopia, and then it turns out to be an absolute disaster mess where like machines take over the world. I didn't want that, but I do want a place where podcasters can really pursue their passions and collaborate and lift each other up. And I'm just really excited about how many people that have reached out and kind of glommed onto that general philosophy. So hit me up if you are one of those people, and I can talk you through some of the needs, requirements, things of that nature. Who knows? Maybe you're the next big showstopper out there. Today, we're going to go a little bit farther into the top board. Yesterday, if you guys watched or listened to the show, you enjoyed? I don't know. Did you enjoy? I guess there's only one way to find out, is if you came back. Yesterday, if you watched the show, you saw or heard, there we go, I'm not surmising on how you felt about it, the Basketball Monster top 10 results from last season. And today we're going to go a little bit farther into that. I want to try to make it so that it's mostly visible on your screen. So we'll try to zoom in a tad, see if we can make this look fairly legible. Can't fit every name on the board there, but most of them. And so today we're going a little bit farther. I like this exercise at this time of year because it gives us a nice opportunity to say, okay, well, what actually happened this season? And did it mean anything? And so yesterday we went through Embiid through Halliburton. That was the top 10. Today we're going to start at number 11, and we're just going to kind of keep going from there. As this offseason goes, we're going to go through a lot of these names. We'll probably take you through, hell, we might go through the top 100 this way at some point. Doesn't all have to be in a row necessarily. That would get kind of dry. We have team reviews to go over, lots of lessons learned. We'll kind of recap a few that were sort of like the last few episodes that I did on Fantasy NBA Today before moving on to start my own network. And mostly because, and I know some of you have heard them already, but many of you haven't. And also, frankly, we just got to populate the feed. There's so many damn things that I got to get into this feed. And frankly, there aren't really enough days to do it. So, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. I got to like rank my show topics 1 through 100 and see what order we can get to them in. Because then news is going to happen and we're going to have to do shows on that too. In any event, welcome. At Dan Vespris is the handle over on social media if you're finding for the first time. Many of you watching live are doing so through social media. So thank you to those. Then I know that number tends to sort of slowly tick up over the course of the broadcast as well, which I think we can officially begin with number 11 from this last year. And that was Kevin Durant, who finished the season playing in 75 out of 82 ball games. Despite all of you guys telling me that he was going to miss half the season due to injury, he did not. Played among the highest minute totals of anybody in the NBA at 37 minutes a ball game. Averaged 27 points, 2.2 three-pointers, I'm going to round a little bit today because it's quicker. 6.5 boards, 5 assists, a steal, 1.2 blocks. And yeah, as usual, solid percentages for KD. If perhaps a tiny bit lower than expected on the, I don't know, field goal percent is it fluctuates a tad, but a tiny bit lower than expected, I would venture to say, on free throw percent. Not that you're going to split hairs on KD shooting 86% at the free throw line, but we've definitely seen him go up near 90. And so to not be there, career 88.5%er, his time basically in Phoenix has been his worst foul shooting since Oklahoma City 10 years ago, which again felt like kind of a one-off. He shot 85.5% in 2014. He shot 85.5% this year. Basically every other season of his career since he's been the Kevin Durant that we know, he's been somewhere between 87 and 92, 93. Tend to kind of hovering in the middle there. The good news from this year on KD is that his usage didn't really change all that much between Brooklyn and Phoenix, where there might have been a little bit of a concern that going to a place where he wasn't the bona fide number one, he was sort of like a 1A or 1B with Devin Booker. Would there be a drop-off in what he got to do? And the answer was not really. A little bit, but not really. He's generally been in that neighborhood. He took 19.1 shots per game, and that's kind of been the number for him basically throughout his career. The number of three-pointers attempted was pretty much right on par. Free throws was down, actually, a little bit for KD, so that's something you could kind of stick in the back of your brain. Assists were pretty close to career norms. Rebounding was pretty close to career norms. Steals were solid. Blocks were normal. Like, everything for KD was almost exactly what you expected, with, I would argue, maybe one small exception. And that was the fact that the free throw number, volume, and percentage was a little bit down. And you could say, oh, well, those will come back, and maybe they do the following year. And if they did, he'd probably be number 10 instead of number 11 on a per-game basis. That's the hair splitting that we're doing on KD. Basically, Kevin Durant turned out to be a really solid play this year for a number of reasons. Number one, because if you draft a guy in the first round and they finish pretty damn close to where you draft them, that's a win, because there just really isn't any place for them to go up from there. And his health was good, so he actually finished number 8 by totals. So KD beat his ADP by totals, and he was basically right on it on a per-game side. There are stories coming out about him already, this sort of post-mortem stuff. Oh, KD's maybe not that happy in Phoenix, blah, blah, blah. I don't know what the hell they're going to do there. I'd be surprised if he was someplace else, but, anything's possible, so wait and see. But if he's back in Phoenix for another year, there's kind of no reason to think that next season won't be about the same as this one. Paul George, number 12 this year. He was able to move kind of back up the board a tad after, I think it's been 2 seasons that have been kind of down for PG. Health was also better this season. Last year, he was number 25 on a per-game basis, and he only played in 56 ball games. The year before that, let me just double-check myself before I throw a name in your face. He was number 16 the year before that. Mostly riding on the shoulders of a ridiculous steals number. That was 2021, 2022. That was when we got back to 82-game seasons. Thank the good Lord. But again, kind of comparing last year to this year, how did PG go from 25 back up to the edge of the first round? The big difference for Paul George was, it's funny. It was almost like kind of a series of small differences might be the better way to describe it. So last year, PG was at 23.8 points per game, almost 3 threes, 6 boards, 5 assists, 1.9 combined defensive stats, and like a 46-87 split with 3 turnovers a game. This year, he was at lower, 22.5 points, 3.3 three-pointers, which, again, really a little bit higher, but not all that different. Rebounds were lower. Assists were lower. Steals and blocks were almost the same. Field goal percent was up from 46 to 47. Free throws was up from 87 to 90. Turnovers was down by 1. It's weird to think that actually made the difference for him when you think about the fact that, rebounding and assists were actually lower this year. it really came down to percentages being a larger impact, turnovers being a much smaller negative. And so it was kind of more of a 9 category push forward for PG. It's very hard, I think, right now for us to figure out what Paul George is going to be next time. Mostly because, by all accounts, he's kind of figuring out what next time is going to be. I think PG's like taking time for himself these days. He's a free agent. He has not yet re-upped. We've heard overtures from the 76ers. I'm sure they won't be the only team that tries to go spend on Paul George. And he's got to figure out if he wants to be back with the Clippers to do whatever this was again, kind of, the whole run it back with Kawhi Leonard with a running mate who's never healthy come playoff time. And James Harden, who fantasy-wise ended up quite fine this year, but generally not the easiest dude to play with. So I don't know. And I think I'd also have to point out that on the Paul George front, like, I don't know that we can necessarily assume that he's going to be right back where he was. So much was tied into the increased percentages from this year, which were high for him, that I'm inclined to think he probably falls back somewhere in the second round next year. So if you drafted PG around, I think his ADP was close to 30. Like, he ended up as a pretty easy win at that point. There was almost no way he was going to be worse than he was the previous season. And then the health was better this year, which was a nice feather in the cap. He played in 74 out of 82 regular season games. That's a nice win for him. He probably gets pretty accurately collected next year. Number 13, Kristaps Porzingis, who played in 57 out of 82 games. He always, and we talked about him shows back. He's he's a games cap darling, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. He had 1 year where he was a bit healthier. That was the last Wizards year, and even that was only 65 ball games. If he gets to 65 games, you call it a win for Porzingis, because he generally doesn't. Meaning, the reason he gets drafted near 40 is because there's an expectation he's going to miss 25 games, which is exactly what he missed this year. The nice thing about KP is that on a per-game basis, he's so freaking good that if he misses 25 games, he still doesn't blow up your team on a games cap side. He was number 40 by totals this year, which is right around his ADP. I love him for Roto because you can just collect all the stats he brings, and when he misses a game, you're like, whatever, I'll fill it in later. Head-to-head, he is not playable, and you can assume that this is just a repeatable thing for Porzingis. He does the same freaking thing every year, and last year when he played in 65 games, he smashed his ADP. When he plays in high 50s, he's going to be right on it. Rinse and repeat. Kristaps Porzingis. Larry Markkanen, number 14. His problem right now is he's on a tanking team. So whatever you do with Markkanen, you're going to have to do it with Utah Jazz season expectations in mind. The Jazz were 31-51 this year. It wasn't a full tank, but they kind of went into the full tank towards the end of the year. And I'll be honest with you guys, I don't know how long they're going to be in this tailspin. How long are they going to be a team that's basically trying to lose basketball games? I have no idea. Haven't a clue. But if they don't make large adjustments, then the best case scenario for Utah is, bottom of the play-in tournament. Is that going to be enough? Is this the year? Markkanen is a much safer play in Roto because, again, if you're dealing with a games cap, then at least when he misses games, he doesn't completely detonate your team. But the difference between Markkanen and Porzingis is that Lowry doesn't get hit with the same injury tag as Porzingis does, meaning the fear of Porzingis missing games due to injury in the general public is larger than the fear of Markkanen missing games due to general shutdown in the public. And that's probably fair because Markkanen went into kind of a shutdown last year and he still got to 66 games played. This year he was a little bit more dinged up, and so with the shutdown, he only got to 55 games played. But look, we got to be honest with ourselves. Markkanen hasn't really played a full season in forever either. I love Markkanen's fantasy game. There's no reason not to. Oh, by the way, Porzingis this year, forgot to give you his stats. 20 points, 2 threes, 7 boards, 2 assists, 0.7 steals, almost 2 blocks, and 51.5, 86 splits. He was awesome. Markkanen, not all that different. Excelled in three-pointers, more so than Porzingis, but KP got him in blocks. That's kind of like the big difference between those two dudes. 23 points for Markkanen, 3+ three-pointers, 8 boards. He out-rebounded Porzingis by 1. They both averaged exactly 2 assists. Markkanen, 0.2 steals higher, only half a block a game. He's not that guy. And then 48-90 splits, so a little worse field goal, a tiny bit better free throw. Tends to balance out, and that's why they had basically the same rank this year. But for Markkanen, again, if you're going into next year and you're going to have to spend a top 20 pick to get Markkanen, where you can spend a top 40 pick on Porzingis, if you think Utah has a chance to be in tank mode again, Porzingis is the better play there. Much as I love both of them, if you can get one for 2 rounds cheaper, that's the direction you go. Number 15 this year on a per-game basis with Jason Tatum, who averaged 27 points, 3 threes, 8 boards, 5 assists, a steal, 0.6 blocks, and 47-83 splits. I hate to say it, but this was relatively predictable because Tatum was number 11 per game last year. He ended up in the top 5 by totals because the whole freaking first round just missed a bunch of basketball games. Even the very best of the best missed a bunch of games last year. And this season, it wasn't quite so lopsided. Top of the first round actually had a bunch of guys that played in games. Shea played in 75, Jokic 79, AD 76, Doncic 70, Wemby 71, Durant 75, Paul George 74. So you had 7 per game guys ahead of Tatum who played in as many or close to as many, call it near the same number of games as Tatum this year. So where last season you saw Jason get that sort of big totals bump into the top 5, this year the totals bump only took him from 15 to 11. 11. Meaning he didn't kill you by any stretch because you probably drafted him at 7. You're like, took him at 7. He was 15 per game. Head to head, you could very easily win your league if your first round pick was Jason Tatum. He did not lose you your league, but he also wasn't super exciting from a fantasy standpoint. The main reasons why are, I think, relatively straightforward. Boston brought in guys that demanded a little bit more usage than what they had the previous year. Tatum went from 21 shots to 19.3. That's like almost the entire story with him. Percentages were very nearly the same. He was up like almost 1% from the field, and he was down about 2.5% at the free throw line. That wasn't enough to make a big difference in his overall value. This was just a guy who took 2 fewer shots. And 1.5, he got to the free throw line 1.5 times less per game. Strictly usage. Strictly. Rebounds were the same. Tiny bit down, I guess. And, some of that, I guess, was playing time. This year he was at 35.5 minutes per game. Last year he was at 37. So that's the rebounding side. Assists were actually up ever so slightly. Steals, tiny bit down. Blocks, tiny bit down. That you can attribute to, playing whatever it was, 5% fewer minutes this year. And that's fine. You don't mind a guy who plays a couple minutes less per ball game. But there's going to be that ever so slight erosion. When a team brings in more guys that can do stuff, that's what happens. Because Boston did it without completely decimating their depth. You could talk about Phoenix as sort of like the counterexample of they brought in a bunch of stars and 2 of those guys still got their normal amount of usage. Almost. Well, that's because Phoenix had nobody else on the whole damn roster. Boston had a roster still. They brought in really good players, but they didn't have to sacrifice a ton of their depth, and then they blew a bunch of teams out. So that was the other story there. So what are you going to do with Tatum next year? Honestly, he should be a guy who goes more towards the end of the first round because, barring one of the core guys for Boston not being there, his role isn't going to change that much. And they're liable here to make another deep playoff run. And at some point, that's going to catch up with him a little bit. Halfway through the next 10. Halfway through. Let's keep going. Number 16 this year was Devin Booker, who I'll admit when he had an ADP of like 13 or 14, I thought that was positively ludicrous. And it turns out he got pretty damn close to it. Played in 68 ball games, which I think you could probably call that a small win after he was hurt to start the year. So his totals rank was not all that far off his per game rank, a little bit lower because, again, guys near the top of the board were slightly healthier this year. So missing 14 games was a little bit more than average, at least for the guys near the upper crust. So Booker finished at 21 by totals, 5 below where he was on a per game side. And, he was good this year. That's a short version. I thought that he was going to be similar to last year, where he was number 29 per game, taking 20 shots per ball game. I thought was, okay, well, this guy's probably going to do a tiny bit less with the basketball. And so you shave off a little bit there. Maybe you consider, could he be a little bit better percentages wise? I don't know, maybe. But that was the handicap. And instead, he got more efficient. So he remember last year he was at 20.1 shots. This year, Booker was at 19.2. But he still turned it into 27 points. So his scoring only was down by 0.7 year over year. 2.1 3-pointers became 2.2, almost exactly the same. Rebounds for Booker, exactly the same. Assists went up because they had no point guards left. He got to 6.9. I get in a lot of arguments with people before the season who are like, Booker's going to average 8 to 10 assists per ball game. I was like, you guys know how hard it is to average 8 to 10 assists per game. He got to 6.9, which I think was still pretty darn good. But you guys may recall, I told you it would be between 6 and 7. And frankly, it was closer to 7 because Bradley Beal was out for half the year. I think Beal's in there. You probably see that number ever so slightly lower. But how does Booker jump around in value when almost all of his stuff stayed the same? Well, the assists going up by 1.5 was a big part of it. Free throws at 89% this year after 85.5 was the other. And kind of surprisingly, doing all of that while keeping turnovers almost exactly the same was the rest of the story. And that's what's so weird about fantasy. Booker was number 29 per game last year. He jumped to number 16. And if you look at his numbers year over year, they don't really look all that different. We're talking about, adding 1.5 assists per game was kind of the big reason for him moving up the board. And free throw became sort of like a hyper elite thing instead of just very good. But that's all it takes. It covered up the slight downtick in shot attempts because he passed a couple more times per ball game. Is it repeatable? Yeah, why not? I would say maybe a tiny bit lower if you expect Phoenix to be a tiny bit healthier. But, maybe Kevin Durant misses time this coming year. So that's one that would probably knock Booker up into the low 20s in shots per game. So, yeah, I think that's repeatable. Booker ended up being a perfectly reasonable play in the early second round. LeBron James, I doubted you. And for that, I am sorry. The king was the frickin' king this year, man. He is not human. 25.7 points, 2 threes, 7.3 boards, 8.3 assists, 1.3 steals, half a block, back up to 54% from the field. Managed to not do too much damage to your free throw number at 75. A little bit lower than the previous year. Turnovers are always going to be a problem for LeBron because, ball's in his hand. But holy crap, man. His field goal percent went up from 50 to 54 in his age 39 season. How is this possible? He is not of this world. And I don't know. Every year I'm like, I think I'm probably going to fade LeBron. And frankly, he was not asked to do as much this year. He went from 22 shots per game last season to 17.9 this year. And his value went up by 6 slots because he was just so unbelievably efficient. His assists were also way better because his team was better around him this year. And it's mind-boggling. And I'd like to say, well, he's going to turn 40 next year, so obviously it must be the time to fade. I have no idea. You know what? I'm perfectly comfortable saying it. I have no freaking clue. None. At some point, LeBron James is going to slow down a little bit. And is it repeatable? Guess we'll see where he is. I think he'll probably be back in LA, but we don't know for sure. 54% feels like a big field goal percent number, though. Number 18. Freddie VanVleet. In all of your faces. I kid. He was number 19 in Toronto. He was number 18 with Houston. And he played in 73 out of 82 ball games. He was actually number 13 by totals. Freddie VanVleet ended up as a big win this fantasy year. Everybody thought he was going to Houston to just like stand by and hand the ball to other dudes. No chance they gave him $40 million to just stand there and hand the ball to people. The scoring on VanVleet this year was weird. His steals were lower. His blocks were higher. And I would venture to say that a lot of that was the strip block, which could have been considered a steal, but they gave him some blocks. So, for all intents and purposes, those things kind of evened out a little bit. Field goal percent was a little bit better this year, from 39.3 last season up to 41.6. And then most of the other stuff for Freddie stayed pretty close to the same. He's at 90% free throw the previous year. This year, I think he was down like 1%, right? No, he's at 86%, so a little bit lower there. Scoring was down a tiny bit from 19.3 to 17.5. Assists went from, I lost it, 7.2 up to 8. And everything else was pretty much the same. So the slight uptick in field goal percent, slight downtick in free throw, slightly lower in points, slightly higher in assists. It all balanced out, and he was almost the exact same value year over year. I don't expect that to change a whole lot either, season over season, and I do expect him to get underdrafted again next year because he doesn't score a ton. Yes, he's a field goal percent problem, but I'm thinking back to where I got Freddie VanVleet in a whole bunch of drafts. Funny thing, too, was he wasn't on the Dan Vesper's Old Man Squad because his ADP wasn't as low as he was actually going in drafts that I was involved in, if that makes sense. And it might not. Freddie VanVleet, I'm trying to think about where his ADP was and then where he got drafted. He looking at my where's the I want ADP numbers. Why can't I find them anymore? Pre-draft ranking, draft analysis. They've changed it. There it is. There's ADP. Yahoo changed to what they were called. So let's get Freddie VanVleet's ADP this year. 30.9. 30.9 was the ADP there. That was an easy yes. And in a lot of the drafts I was in, pretty much the Yahoo public prize drafts, he went later than that. Now, I didn't have to get him in the middle of the third round. I get him at the end of the third round in those drafts. And that one, it was like an absolute freaking no-brainer. Will he go that far again? I don't think he'll fall to the end of the third round next year. You'll probably see him go late second. Maybe early third would be my guess, like 25 to 30 range. And I think I'd be okay with that. Not as much value piped in, but it's not a disaster play. You guys still see the names on the board? Yeah, you can still see the names on the board, just barely. Number 19 this year was Chet Holmgren, who by totals, by the way, you guys ready for this? 7. Played in all 82 games this year. Chet Holmgren was number 7 by totals. He was on the Dan Vesper's Old Man Squad this year, and you're like, Dan, he's not old. Yeah, I know. It's just a name. It's typically names of guys that I think fall because their fantasy profile is overlooked. And with Holmgren, the reason I thought that he actually didn't have as much buzz as he could this year was because people were worried about his slender frame. And I think folks didn't realize how easy it is to climb the board when you're a shot blocking big man who doesn't hurt in either percentage. And that's what he is. That's the quote unquote unicorn build. Those guys can rocket up the fantasy charts really easily without having to be extraordinary in many other statistical categories, mostly because blocks are so rare that an extra half block per ball game makes it so that you just don't have to be as great in other stuff. You can't be awful in anything, right? Because then you're more of a traditional big man. Like if you're a punt free throw big man, that's going to drag your ranking down the board. But if you're a big man who can block shots, which Chet can, he averaged 2.3 of them this year, and doesn't hurt percentages. In fact, he was a positive in field goal and he was basically a net neutral in free throw. You're like locked into top 50 and you almost don't have to do anything else. And the list of players that are like that, Porzingis is kind of like your prime example of a shot blocking big man who doesn't hurt your percentages. Anthony Davis could also go in there, but he also, he's hyper elite in a bunch of stuff. So I kind of took him out of the mix. Same with Joel Embiid. I'm talking about the guys who are not super elite in anything else other than they're very good at shot blocking and they don't hurt you in percentages. Now, Porzingis is very good at free throws, so that's why he's kind of at the top of that heap. But sort your rank board by shot blocking this year. Look at the top shot blockers and look at how many of them are at least okay, not disastrous in either percentage, and then look at their rank. So you got Holmgren, who's up near the top, and he's decent in both. You got Brook Lopez, who was number 46, despite really doing almost nothing besides blocking shots and being good in percentages. I don't think I can give Gafford. He's not quite good enough at free throw percent. You got Miles Turner, who's number 52, who actually wasn't as good at free throws this year. JJJ, who wasn't as good at field goal percent this year. But that's kind of your mold on those. And that's frankly most of the guys that fit it. If Jonathan Isaac actually got consistent minutes, he would probably pull himself up into that grouping as well. And then you got a bunch of other shot blockers that do other stuff, more traditional big types. Walker Kessler, who is a bad free throw shooter and got dumped on all year, but ended up actually like kind of being okay. Claxton, Gobert, Gafford, Mobley, Pirtle, Clint Capella, if you go far enough down the board. And now you're moving away from that kind of unicorn construction. But that's what Chet Holmgren looks like. He looks like he could be in that unicorn construction. And the only things that he doesn't do yet are really kind of push high enough in either scoring or rebounding to get to that next plateau. Because he needs to be, I need him to get to the very good marker in one other category. Right now, he's excellent in shot blocking. He's elite shot blocker. And he's good in field goal percent. And he's good in rebounding. Not great in either of those. And then he's just sort of like adequate in a bunch of stuff. I need him to get from good to great in one of the two things where he's good right now. Or I need him to go from adequate to good in one of the other things. So could scoring go from 16.5 up to 20? That would do it. I don't think that's super feasible, but it's possible. Could he hit 2 and change 3-pointers instead of 1.6? What's the most likely thing for Chet? Honest to goodness, I don't really know, especially if OKC adds any other bodies. But if he gets to do more next year, that's probably your most likely. 11.6 shots maybe becomes like 12.5 or 13. You see the points, the threes, the field goal percent impact, all of that increases. That's how he moves up into that kind of topmost group of these unicorns. But getting all the way to the first round is a bit of a challenge. And finally, the last name, which I realize is not super easy to see on the YouTube or Twitter feed right now, is Scottie Barnes. It's hidden ever so slightly behind my own face. I think I can actually fix that with a zoom out button. Ta-da! Scottie Barnes played in just 60 ball games this year because the Raptors went into tank mode. Yeah, say whatever you want. I mean, that's the reason that it happened. I know he's technically out with a hand injury, but like, might he have tried to come back? Who knows? 20 points, 8.2 boards, 6 assists, 2.8 combined defensive stats, 1.7 threes, 47.5 from the field, 78 at the free throw line, 2.8 turnovers. he was a guy that took a colossal step forward. He's just the type of player that I generally don't attack super hard. Am I looking at the right thing here? Might not be looking at the right thing. Because we haven't, quote unquote, seen it yet. And honest to goodness, I'm okay with the fact that we didn't have Scottie Barnes this year. He was not on my teams. The guys we hit on were more like Holmgren, Tyrese Maxey, some of the older guys. We had plenty of hits in the top 40, top 50. Barnes wasn't one of them. Is this a mea culpa? Not really. Like, I'm an analyst. I'm not going to get all of them right. The way that I play fantasy basketball, and those that have been following for a long time, you guys know I tend to be pretty conservative in how I attack the draft. I tend not to blow early picks on guys that I don't see the obvious translation of their fantasy game. And with Barnes, you can yell at me all you want. It wasn't that obvious. Like the fact that he became a bona fide solid three-point shooter while also dramatically increasing his usage and also suddenly became a shot blocker. It was reminiscent of the Brandon Ingram, that like initial year in New Orleans, where he just sort of became a different player. He fixed his free throw percent, his steals, his blocks, his three-pointers. Like he fixed 4 categories in one offseason between the Lakers and the Pels. A couple of those things have actually kind of come back to earth since that time. It's extraordinarily rare to see a guy fix 3 or 4 categories without a massive adjustment in like the way they play the game. And for here, like typically you see a guy whose usage gets bumped, gets juiced the way Scottie Barnes did this year. And you usually see some things kind of pivot in the opposite direction. But instead, not only did his usage go up by a lot, his field goal percent went up with it. His field goal percent went up. His free throw percent went up by a little. I don't know if we can count that as like being fixed necessarily. His blocks went way up. Field goal percent, blocks, threes doubled. And then, of course, you know, you tack on the usage stuff. So obviously the scoring and the assists were higher as well. That was maybe a little bit more predictable. And you thought, all right, well, there's a chance that like 2 of these things get better. But remember, he was number 85 last year per game because his percentages were both bad. And yeah, he had some scoring, some boards, and some assists and some steals mixed in there. But his minutes per game almost didn't change year over year. There was absolutely positively no reason to suspect that with a usage increase, which we figured points and assists would go up a little bit, that threes and blocks and field goal percent would also all go up. If you took a chance on that, great, you hit. That's not the way that I personally handicap fantasy basketball. It's just not the way I do it. I look for guys where the fantasy stat set is an easier translate. This year, the guys that had that jump that I liked were Holmgren, who was a rookie, so it wasn't really a jump necessarily. Tyrese Maxey was more of one that I thought made more sense. He was on the old man squad. Just like, look, you inject a ton of usage into this dude, and his value is going to go through the roof. We didn't need miraculous jumps in categories that were wildly unpredictable. That's the type of guy we're going to get. We're probably not going to get the next Scottie Barnes. If you're looking at someone for next year that's like, oh, their percentages were bad and you need a magical increase in threes and shot blocking and field goal percent while also getting more usage. I'm going to miss on those guys. And I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with the fact that that's the type of massive leap forward we're just not going to catch. We're going to catch the other ones. Because for every Scottie Barnes there is out there of a guy who was in the 80s and everybody was like, oh, you know, usage bump. Here comes an increase. There's going to be a bunch of dudes just like that who fall flat on their face. And Jordan Poole is probably the example of that, where, you know, big usage jump was coming seemingly, but what with it needed to also come field goal percent increase, things of that nature. You could translate it. He was like, what, 120, 130 or something like that with the Warriors the previous year. There needed to be extra categories that also took that jump forward. And for Barnes, they did it, but we didn't get Barnes, but we dodged Jordan Poole. That's just one example from each side from this last season. If I really went deep diving on this one, I'm sure we could find multiple examples of the same kind of thing of guys where I'm like, yeah, you think, but Anthony Edwards actually might be an example from this year. By the way, love Anthony Edwards. Super awesome basketball player to watch. Maybe possibly the most exciting player in the NBA right now. But everybody was like, oh, big usage jump is coming for him year over year. And I was like, where? Exactly where is this massive jump coming from? Who's out for the Wolves that I don't know about? In fact, I mean, Cat's back this year. If anything, usage was going to be harder to come by. And not surprisingly, his shots exactly the same. His rank, 2 slots different year over year. So we're going to dodge that kind of stuff. Now, by the way, to Ant's credit, he's super durable. So, like, it wasn't a disastrous play to take him at 13, but he didn't get anywhere near there on the per game side. We're going to dodge situations like that. And yes, every once in a while, a Barnes is going to emerge and everybody's going to be like, Dan, you idiot. You didn't take enough chances here. But that's not how I see it in my mind. And I hope the fact that you guys have followed me for 4 shows or potentially 8 years indicates that you kind of agree with that general philosophy, which is if you don't see the outlines of it, don't do it. There are plenty of other places to make your hay on fantasy draft night, and I believe that we will continue to do so. And that's where we'll put a pin in things today. Hey, there are a couple hundred of you guys watching live on Twitter, a couple of you on YouTube, but mostly on Twitter. And everybody listening on a traditional pod channel, just a quick PSA for you guys at the end of the show. And I'm going to be doing this every single show here while we build up, probably at least until like October. No matter where you're taking in the content, please subscribe to as many different places as you can find this as humanly possible. Why is that important? Well, because subscriptions is how all of these websites decide what show actually gets sort of semi-promoted. The links are in the show description if you're listening after the fact or watching on YouTube. If you're watching live on Twitter, there's a link that I just put on the screen to a tweet that I did a few days ago that has all the links that are relevant. But frankly, the easiest place to do it if you're watching on social media is just to go to my page, twitter.com/Dan Vespris, and look at the pinned tweet. That's got all the links in it. If you scroll through, that tweet is like a 2 or 3 thread. It's got all the links. iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, YouTube, whatever, all the places that you might need to find this podcast. Please subscribe to all of them. Subscriptions are the big thing right now. If you have time to like a post on Twitter, that's great. If you have time to retweet it, that's also great. If you have time to do a 5-star review on one of these places, that's also great. But please subscribe. And I'm really looking at you folks that are watching live on Twitter because I get nothing for doing this show live on Twitter. The only person that benefits from that is the guy who runs Twitter. And, whatever. I'm indifferent toward that. But I'm hoping that I can also benefit from it. So please, all of these other places, YouTube, iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, etc., all of those places run advertisements or through our partners at Believe, run advertisements on the show. That's what allows me to build this new thing up. I need you guys subscribing and I need those ads running. And Twitter's the only place where I don't see a single red cent. So I don't mean to make that sound like a selfish thing. I have to be a little bit selfish right now because I went from having a job to choosing to not have one. So I need your guys' help. Please subscribe. Let's keep growing this thing. Why did I launch it in mid-May? Nobody knows for sure, but I did. So let's grow it slowly here through the off season, and we'll be back with you for another episode tomorrow. Yep, we're back, baby. Almost done with our first week on the new feed. This is Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball, the founding member of the Old Man Squad Sports Network. and one of 2 shows on said network right now, along with my good buddy, Joe Orico, whose new fantasy baseball show is called 90 Feet from Home. Please go check that out as well. And we'll have new shows again next week coming up. We grow. I never hold still. Have a great Thursday. Hasta mañana.